So today we'll be going to look at a video which is an interview of Posie Parker, who is a radical feminist. Posie Parker could be said to be a second wave feminist. She is not a third wave feminist because she does not agree with what is known as intersectional feminism, or at least intersectional feminism to the extent it has reached with the third wave feminism. The reason why this video is important is because it sheds light on a key aspect of the civilization, a point where traditionalists, moderates, liberals, and feminists, radical feminists, have all agreed, come to terms, and arrived at a very similar conclusion. And that conclusion will be worth addressing here. The conclusion of all these groups, which were at odds with each other for as long as one can remember in his lifetime, shows the real nature of the politics, where the enemy of my enemy could be my friend. The traditionalist feminist narrative, or as it is presented in several circles, is a synchronization of traditionalist mindset with the feminist mindset, culminating in a very important and radical view, which is a view necessary to be looked into as it will form the key defining feature of this era and the next era, forming a sort of Hegelian thesis, which will give rise to the next zeitgeist. What it means is something that we will see itself in the video. But what is important to understand now is that this strange union that someone would have never thought occurs because all of these four groups are essentially consequentialist in nature. A consequentialist group is a group which bases its policy decisions on the consequences of those decisions on the societies and the individuals it seeks to include in its own group. As such, all these four ideologies to look at particular policies adopt what is called uh, the best word would be here to use is a non-fundamentalist approach. Fundamentalist here means a position. Fundamentalist position here means a position based on some fundamental values and thus derived based on some form of deduction or induction from those principles. A consequentialist, however, adopts those positions which he believes are good for its own cause, good for society, or good for certain individuals or groups of individuals. As such, the next war that will be fought is between the consequentialists and what could be called as principalists, which includes the left of section of the right, a certain part of the left, and a certain part, key part of the right-leaning moderates or right-leaning centrists. As this war would be waged with unexpected allies and unexpected enemies, this becomes important to understand the political nature of the society and how it develops over time. As such, we will be looking at this video and will try to analyze the key aspects which make or break the political dealings and the political rhetoric. So let's begin and try to analyze this video. Uh, so let's start.
And I think the Green Party called us non-trans, called women, I mean non-trans women. I mean, fuck off. It's no.
Right from the start, what is highlighted as the key point here is actually the key point. And it is worth understanding what this key point means. This whole battle is not mostly because the harmful effects of the transgender ideology on women. It is about preserving the identity of the woman. The identitarian politics has been, whether people agree or not, a key feature of the West, though it was only practiced by so-called marginalized groups. The reason why identitarianism becomes important for certain sections of the society is when these sections of the society realize that the collective bargaining based on the interests professed by their group is an important tool in shifting the resources or the advantages or the dividends of the society towards them. Their complaints or their reasoning may be justified or not justified. That is beside the point. One is the point is that the position itself is based on the idea that the collective interests of the people would overpower the individual interests of the people. In the matters of politics, especially in the societies where the majority rule plays an important part in formation of policy positions adopted by the government. As such, as more of the West is moving towards identitarianism, the crucial aspect to be gained from the first sentence is that the radical feminist movements, all the feminist movements in a nutshell, is about the identity of the woman. And as such, it is at odds with the progressive wing of feminism, which is about progressivism. So it is the battle between progressivism versus identitarian ideologies based on the concept of uniqueness and exclusivity of womanhood. We will try to understand these arguments in light of this, because it forms the key point which will guide us throughout the discussion. So let's move on.
Hello and welcome to Triggernometry. I'm Francis Foster.
I'm Konstantin Kissin.
And this is a show for you if you're bored with people arguing on the internet over subjects they know nothing about. At Triggernometry, we don't pretend to be the experts, we ask the experts.
Our guest this week is a controversial women's rights campaigner. Posie Parker, welcome to Triggernometry.
Thank you very much.
I added the word controversial to your introduction. I think it's merited. I think that's fair to say.
It is controversial to assert what I do, yeah.
Yeah, well, for anyone who doesn't know what you do, tell us a little bit about who you are, how are you where you are, particularly this chair right now. What's been your journey through life that's brought you here?
Okay, so about 2015, when the Tories were elected, I was a firm Labour member and had always voted Labour in my adult life.
I'm Jewish, by the way.
And the Tories got elected, and I think most people were really shocked after the coalition. I think everybody thought that good old Jeremy was going to get his chance. Thankfully, he didn't. And I joined this massive lefty forum, and it was called Amazing Lefty Women or Awesome Lefty Women. And I joined when it was about 500 members, and it went up to a 20,000 membership. And mainly women, very disorganised, having no clue, just whining about what was going on. But then something interesting started happening, and that was lots of men who identified as women started joining. And I was a bit skirting around it, couldn't really understand what was happening. There was lots of sort of she, and oh my gosh, you're so stunning and brave. Those sort of lots of fawning.
And when you say lots of men, how many are we talking? When you say lots, was it a few people? Or was it
about 20, sort of, and they stuck out a mile. Many of them looked like truckers in a dress. And this one man came in and he told like a Bernard Manning type joke, and the essence of which, I think the punchline was, a feminist tied to my radiator in the basement after a beating or something, some sort of male violence type thing that generally women don't tell jokes like that. And I sort of, are you sure you identify as a woman?
This very opening paragraph shows how the politics is defined. So Posie Parker was an extreme lefty for most of her life. She stood with all the position of the left, and she still stands now. But somehow, if you go to the traditional sections, to the right wing sections, they are filled with fawning over her. People are impressed by her, though she maintains all her radical leftist positions, and she herself says that she was pretty leftist. The moderates love her, the traditionalists love her, or at least some of them, and some of the right wing people also love her. Why is that? Why is that over a single issue? If you have a person who is completely different than you, who has completely different positions than you, and radical by your standards, are in completely opposite direction, but he agrees with you on one point, why would you fawn over that person? Why would you think that that person is mostly right? Why is that so prevalent in conversations like these? The reason for that is because it's all about the consequences. Posie Parker was a leftist until she found that the left wing didn't cater to her needs and her wants. And then she became anti labor. Similarly, traditionalists see that their dream, their wishes, are realized in Posie Parker. So do few of the right wing people, and so do few of the moderates. And so they side with her because they see her as their voice, even though she might agree with them only on a few positions out of hundreds of important positions in the political realm, in the political and social realm. The second thing which is important to note here is that right from the start she is stereotyping men in order to say that they are not actually women. She says that the men who came there, look like men in dresses, truckers in dresses. The second thing she points out about the type of jokes that they used to say. Now, few of you might be thinking that maybe these stereotypes are justified. But think about it. She's a second wave feminist. The second wave feminists fought a war against gender stereotypes. Would it be fair to say that a woman who acts masculine is not actually a woman? What is the use of bringing stereotypes inside the conversation? And this is her when she was not against transgender or transgender ideology. Even then, she used stereotypes to identify male versus female behavior, while adopting to a position that is based on the idea that these stereotypes are negative and are harmful. And the second wave feminists fought actively to crush those stereotypes, often passing laws which restricted the application of those stereotypes to the extent the government had power. The people who are actively against stereotypes, they themselves have stereotypes. And these stereotypes are the ones they use to justify their political position. Because stereotypes allow people to form a quick snapshot of a situation at hand and decide their response based on their quick snapshot. We all function through stereotypes. If we see a homeless man, perhaps we would be afraid more than we would see a well-dressed man walking on a street, because we have a stereotype in our mind. We may have a stereotype in our mind that homeless people may be robbers or may be part of a gang. These stereotypes often play a role in giving us an advantage by not by preventing our brain from using any excessive intellectual capacity and processing that information, which can easily be processed by thumb rules, though it may not even yield accurate results in all situations. These are what these are. This is the benefit of the stereotypes, and this is the reason why stereotypes continue to exist. But what is important here is to show you that The stereotypes is not something associated with the people who are bigots, and not associated with the people who are for radical equality, or against bigotry, but they are associated with everyone. The problem that people have with stereotypes is exactly the problem that people have with the use of speech. They disagree with it when it is against the behavior or against the people or against the group that they have sympathy towards or they have liking to. As such, the stereotypes are bad only and only when they offend the section which believes that those stereotypes are unjust and responds not by arguing that it is offended by the stereotypes, but that the stereotypes themselves all are bad to acquire, to allow their position to have more weight than it is due to them. Thus, the battle against the stereotype was not a battle for truth or against falsity, but the battle against stereotypes was the battle exclusively against something that the people found offensive and did not wish to associate themselves with. This is an important point to keep in mind as we move on further.
And I could sort of hear this northern sort of 1970s comic voice every time I sort of read something that he said. It's really weird. And he went absolutely nuts at me. But that was bad. But all the women joined in, saying that I was hateful, disgusting, transphobic. How could I question this man or woman, they would say. He knows better than I do how he identifies. And so then I was switched on to, actually, if I'm not allowed to talk about this, and this is obviously very serious, and I need to talk about it as much as I possibly can, find like-minded people, had sort of secret things online, and then we just noticed the language just disappearing. And then I was interviewed by the police for making comments about mermaids, saying that I thought transitioning children was abuse. And I talked about Susie Green taking her son to Thailand and having castrated for his 16th birthday, which I thought was an unusual gift.
I'm sure my mum fantasised about doing that at times.
And so, and I just made these comments, and then I got interviewed under caution by the police, and I think I was one of the first women to be interviewed by the police for this.
What was it specifically that you said? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was
So
a
it's
question
6
I was going to
tweets.
ask.
So there's a couple of really sinister things about this. Number one, it was 6 tweets. It was things like transitioning children is abuse. I think so I'm banned from Twitter forever. My IP address is banned. And I'd said they'd had...
I can get a Russian maid to sort you out with a new IP. That's no problem.
I can't be bothered. It's such a cesspit,
Yeah.
Twitter. I'm quite happy
you're
not
right.
to be on it. But they'd teamed up with Magnum ice creams, and so I'd sort of said it was a bit like, hey kids, do you want some sweeties? You know, come. And it was a bit grooming, and I'd made comments about that. And I'd also said that she'd castrated the boy. And the police approached Twitter, who released my contact information. And this was at a time where they couldn't get a jihadi's address, but they got my details released from Twitter, which is why I think by the time I was interviewed, it was February, and I'd made the comments the September before. So that was quite sinister, I thought.
And what was the police process like? Was it just one interview? Was it a series of interviews?
It was one interview. It was about an hour and a half. They text me, right? So they text me and said, "Oh, we'd like to get in touch with you," and I just ignored.
Okay, this is quite boring, so I will speed it up. But remember one thing here: the UK doesn't have a complete freedom of speech. In UK, I believe up to 2015, saying something insulting, which could be overheard by somebody and could have caused distress to him or her, was a crime. Until now, there are certain speeches which are not just threatening, but could be objectionable, are still criminalized, as I believe, or at least are still illegal. And the people who make those, people who say those things or adopt those behaviors, they may be non-threatening. And if they are overheard by somebody or they are seen by somebody, it could result in a valid case against the person who said that thing or professed that kind of behavior. So it is important to note here that for all it is said, a freedom of speech was not part of UK and is not part of it and has not been part of UK for quite a long time. Now let's move on.
It because I had no idea that the police texted people and goes, "Can we interview you?" And so I thought it was like a prank, and somebody had managed to get my number, and they persisted, and so I phoned him back, and it was this cheeky chap from Yorkshire who was, well, you know, we've all had conversations about it around the dinner table, and he was all lovely and friendly. And then I spoke to my sort of online group, and they said, you should get a solicitor. Don't go to that interview without someone. So I got a solicitor who was this 6'4", very posh, older gentleman. The sort of guy that was so posh he could stop in the middle of a sentence and people would just wait until he continued. You know, that sort of, that gravitas. And he came along with me, and I wrote a prepared statement, and just, that was read out. But she had given the police a 5-page account of my tweets, and most of that was her life story with her son and why he transitioned, and that was read out in full in the police interview. And they sort of said things like, did you know that actually sex reassignment surgery doesn't include castration? Just mind-blowing. Like, what did they think that sex reassignment surgery actually was? Did they honestly think that boy came home with his testicles intact? You know, it was insane. And they called me hateful for calling Janet Mock a man. And at the end of it, they sort of asked my solicitor what he thought they should do. Because I hadn't spoken, I just sort of had to sit there defiantly and just say no comment. And obviously I've watched a lot of movies. I thought I was quite good at no comment. And they recommended it to the CPS. They pushed it forward to try and get me prosecuted for malicious communications, hate speech, a conspiracy, because other people had said similar things to me. So it was like there was a conspiracy against Susie Green. Not that she's a public figure receiving millions of public money, or certainly $500,000 of lottery funding to go and spread her odious little message to small children.
And what was the result of that prosecution?
They didn't go forward with it. So the CPS decided there wasn't enough evidence.
Surprisingly.
Yeah, I was so shocked.
Okay. And you're wearing a T-shirt with the definition of a woman, and that is part of a campaign that you then organised.
Yes.
So tell us about that.
So in about July of... there's been a couple of controversies about me by that point, by women from my own side. Nasty, defamatory, horrible, typical leftist behaviour. And so I was a little bit controversial at that point.
I hear her just say typical leftist behavior. Did she know that after conversion? Or did she know that before conversion? And if she knew that before conversion, why was she still associated with the left? Because consequentialism, right? You see how it completely fits the picture.
Within my own movement, and I wanted to do something that sort of, what was the essence of this? What was really going on? And what it was is we couldn't talk about being women anymore. So we couldn't use a word, we couldn't use female language, and people knew exactly what we meant. Like, women were beginning to be told that we had to put cis in front of our name, or that trans women are women. And so I wanted to get this word back. And I thought, well, I think if we put something, at first I was going to do a Times advert, but I didn't have 40 grand. If we're going to push these people. Like what basically we need to do is we need to allow these trans activists to speak, because when they speak, everybody will hear just how insane their demands are. And we knew that if we put something really neutral up on a billboard that said woman, the definition of woman, that they would kick off and they would have a real big problem with that. And they did. And the way I did it is I raised money through selling T-shirts and stickers.
The second important point here to notice that the feminists have, starting from the first wave, always tried to redefine words. And now she's complaining about the way that the woman cannot use gender language, though the gender language was still very questionable. At the very time of the second wave feminism, what third wave feminism has brought is not something extra, but the fulfillment of the second wave feminism. The reason why she's so confident that the transgender ideologues will be viewed negatively by the people is because she's sure that the society will favor the position of women over the position of the transgenders. Because transgenders, while they form a minority, they are not attractive, they are not sexually appealing, men don't have an interest in them, women don't have any interest in them, and they are generally the real outcast. Women were never outcast, and they knew that, and this is the reason why they knew that their demands would be met. Women still know that they are not the outcast, but they have to pretend that they are the outcast so that the people who would not otherwise listen to them, because they are not overcome by such a desire based on their sexual instincts or protective instincts, women have to identify as outcasts so as to allow their demands to be put on a pedestal. And she knows that, and this is the reason why she's so confident. She's so confident that putting the definition of woman on a billboard will get people to side by her side, because the transgenders will state their position and people will be disgusted by that. The disgust is the key feature here. Disgust is exactly the same thing which second wave feminists fought against in order for emancipation of women. And strangely here, we see the use of the same emotion to put the spotlight on the transgender people. This is how the politics work. The progressive of the yesteryears is now the conservative. But it is not because he is actually the conservative, but because he is a consequentialist, and now he is fighting to retain his or her own privilege. In this sense, you will realize how Marx was not completely wrong. And leftism has something to say about this type of bourgeois liberalism. Let's move on.
And you say they've got insane demands. What are their demands?
Well, they sort of say trans rights. And then you say, well, what are those rights? Because as a man or a woman in this country, you're allowed to pretty much do the same sort of things. You know, I have a little bit of right when it comes to maternity, because actually growing a baby inside your body is something I think deserves a little bit of room. But generally speaking, I don't know what rights they don't have, except to invade women's spaces. That seems to be the beginning and end of the demand, is the demand. So transgenderism is to pretend to be the opposite sex or to lie about your sex, and transphobia is the refusal to believe that lie.
And you say
Another key takeaway from this comment. Realize this, right? What we have just seen her say is that she talks about how men and women have almost equal rights. Women have a little extra, but that's justifiable because women grow babies inside their womb. She doesn't point out any extra right that men have. The men also have certain responsibilities because she knows that men don't have any extra rights. But if that is the case, and that is exactly what she believes, why she was lefty or a feminist? If she believed that the feminism had achieved its goal, why be a feminist? Why she was feminist before this? But the reason why she is saying that men and women have equal rights is to undercut transgender ideology. if men and women have equal rights, then the transgender claim makes no sense. It only makes sense if one of the sexes have lesser rights, and so the people who are transitioning are trying to get more rights by transitioning. But she does not want to say that. When she was a feminist, she would have believed that women have fewer rights. In X, Y, or Z sense, this is the reason why she was a feminist. But now, when she has to battle out trans ideology, she has to pretend that her position was and is, and her belief is that men and women have equal rights. She's the one lying to herself. And the reason why she's doing it is so as to undercut trans ideology. Now, suddenly, men and women are equal, so transgender ideology doesn't make sense, because it only makes sense if one of them is favored. Because if no one is being favored, then there is no reason for transition. Secondly, she talks about the fact that the transgenders only want to invade female only spaces. But that is not true. You have a complete list of demands, however you feel about it, from the transgenders, which include more than invading female only spaces. So, what is all of this nonsense is about? This is about a very fact that she's trying to. She's still being the lefty, and she's trying to present a version of the transgender ideology as something of a creepy, dominant sort, which is exactly the same way the women treated men, by by arguing that the men were creepy or dominant, or wanted something of women, while women were nice creatures who were just uh, caring about their own rights. And this is exactly the same feminine tactic being used against the trans women. That is because the female nature stays consistent no matter which position you adopt. So her position is that women only spaces are women only spaces, and transgenders are crazy in demanding that women only spaces should be invaded by men. But haven't radical feminists advocated for a complete destruction of male only spaces, or at least few of the male only spaces, in those areas where the feminists felt that they were being denied certain rights, or they were not being afforded something that they desperately wanted? They have tried to take away the right of the males to have those spaces, and have invaded the male only spaces in those respects. And this is exactly what the transgenders are doing. Those spaces in which transgenders believe they have an interest in, those spaces they are demanding for themselves. It is the same thing, by principle, what feminists demanded, that I have an interest in this space, and this is a male only space, and I want in. The same thing is the transgenders are demanding. However, the difference here is that transgenders are not females, or at least trans women in her mindset. So they cannot make this demand. These demand can only be made keeping the women's uh, in the center who is making those demands, because her ideology is about the identitarianism for the woman. As such, if men demand to enter in the female only spaces because they feel that there is something is denied to them, then they should not decide. Women should decide whether they would allow these people inside their spaces. But if the reverse is the case, then the men cannot decide whether women should be allowed in their spaces, but it is the women who will decide, because they are being denied something, and they are the ones who are being oppressed. So, in both the positions, it is the women who will decide whether they are the ones who are invading, or whether they are the ones who are defending their space. Here, you will see a very key similarity, and the reason why traditionalist movements are associated with the feminist movements. Because traditionalists, liberals, feminists, and moderates all believe that the women should have this extra privilege. Now, this because this extra privilege is granted based on the idea that women should have this kind of privilege as a necessity, based on her uh, identific biological sex being the woman. You will find that all of the laws that you see in the society that have persisted that you may have felt are anti-male, or all the policies that you have seen in the society that you may have perceived as anti-male, are not because of just leftists, but because of all these four groups. And this is the reason why all these four groups, being in majority, would form the thesis for the next era, in which the others, who would be disenfranchised males, would form the antithesis and will drive the zeitgeist of the society. On this note, I would end this video. We will continue rest of the video later in another segment. But one of the important takeaway from whole of the segment is that the clash of the civilization is not between traditionalists versus progressives, or the conservatives versus the liberals, or the right versus the left. It is between the principalists versus the consequentialists, and it has always been that way. When traditionalists were principalists, they were fighting against the progressives. They were fighting against the feminists. Now traditionalists are consequentialists, and that is the reason why they are willing to join hands with radical feminists, because they believe that joining the hands with radical feminists would help them gain those privileges or advantages in society that their ideology subscribes to. So as the traditionalists have moved on to being consequentialists, leaving only the real right wing people as the principalists, the association of the real right wing with the real left wing against this sort of consequentialism forms the real antithesis of the fringe against the moderates. So fringes are always in the anti position of the moderate position, which they are trying to change, and thus form the zeitgeist of the society, because the moderates always lose and give on the position and stay to the fringes. What it shows is that the animosity between the right and the left is not so much as the animosity in real life between the principalists and the consequentialists, and forms what is the Hegelian dialectic. Now we will end this conversation. I will move on next time and look at the other segment, in which we will see the important views or important points that the radical feminist movement, or the TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, are making, and the points that the transgenders are making, and we'll see how it impacts the society. Till then, I guess bye. See you.